witnesses. I have listened the entire session and have found it very, very interesting. You know, I also represent an area that's impacted by climate change very much, Southern California, sea level rise. But I'm also, what's unique about my district is that I represent the port area of Long Beach and Los Angeles, which over 20 years ago was part of the dirtiest collection of industrial concentration. 40% of our nation's goods come in and out of the port area in my district. But there have been dramatic changes, and part of that has, and I'm going to ask both Ms. Arroyo and also Dr. Sperling, has to do with some of the incentives and some of the money that's been provided for freight. So I want to focus on freight. Much of our discussion today has been, although it's been mentioned, has been on really passenger vehicles and others. But I think that much of what we've done in California, I'm wondering how that translates to the rest of the nation. I think, Ms. Arroyo, you mentioned in your testimony, I think the written testimony, about how the cap-and-trade program has helped a lot. I know Dr. Sperling has worked very much on that through CARB also. But first, and I'm interested in how we've attacked in California, or we've targeted our state's freight sector in a way that we've moved towards zero-emission yard equipment and heavy-duty trucks that moving towards zero emission, and charging outlets, and now talking about Tier 3 container ships. And so we're kind of moving in that direction in California. Interesting now that, as Dr. Sperling has mentioned, I still have circled it in his right, that emissions are, no matter what, even though what we're doing, emissions are still rising. And even though I've heard all this reduction from other members, that one sentence has frightened me the most, that all this amount of resources that we're doing, I'm just kind of wondering from you, even though this is not the critical question, when are we going to reach a tipping point where those emissions start to drop? Is it that we need new kinds of, you mentioned about sharing and automation and also electrification. But the question I want from Ms. Arroyo is that how are we going to build upon what you mentioned, let's say things like the funding cycles like cap and trade and others, cost of carbon. What do we need to do to move the rest of the nation towards adopting this? California's paid, and I'm not saying it's just California, it's paid a lot of attention towards reducing. But what is the rest of it? What do we need to do? What are the major things for freight? Is it the same as passenger vehicles? What are the incentives that we really need to do?
So there are a lot of different approaches to freight, including trying to shift from the roads to rail, as the gentleman on this side of the aisle mentioned earlier, and also short sea shipping, which is hard to say fast, so I said it
and the ports
slowly.
Are moving towards rail. Much more, because as was pointed out, we're not going to build more through urban centers. We're not building more highways, and our growth continues, even though they've demonstrated that they can reduce the pollution, but the growth is still there, and I think rail has been certainly one of the answers.
But I think that there's definitely a role for a committee like this one, because what we found in facilitating the Transportation and Climate Initiative over 8 years now or more has been that there's a great interest in the states in this region, which runs from Virginia now all the way up to Maine, in working together to analyze what the freight flows into and around the region are, and to try to move it to more efficient options, which would actually save our roads for passenger vehicles, get it into rail or shipping, et cetera. Look at the emissions benefits that come from that. And there really, frankly, hasn't been a lot of support for that, so that work hasn't been as sustainable as other work that we've done together. For example, on electric vehicles, where there have been DOT and DOE grants to support corridor planning and things like that. So one of the things that this group as a region is looking at is a policy proposal that would be under development this year to have a cap and invest program that would generate proceeds that could be invested in cleaner and more resilient transportation infrastructure. And that's to be determined by the states themselves over the course of the year.
I know I'm just about out of time, but Dr. Sperling, any other thoughts about freight?
frankly, there, you know, you need to think of it both on the technology side and on the logistics use side. And I think we're making some progress on the technology side.
Right.
On the logistics side, that's why we're seeing the emissions going up on the passenger side as well as on the freight side. And part of the challenge is that states don't have much jurisdiction over the rail. Rail is great, but you know, part of it is dealing with that issue because of interstate commerce. And aviation, the same thing. So we need a renewed focus, but it's the states and locals that really need to focus on this, what's happening at the local area. And frankly, with the, I call it the Amazonization of delivery, we're seeing this proliferation of warehouses all through our communities now, and it's resulting in a lot more local truck VMT, which is, and LA is right at the forefront of that.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. We'll now go to Mr.